everybody, and welcome to AppGroups, where we apply the message we heard this week at Freedom Valley Church. We have been in this Wayward series now for 5 weeks, and I have learned so much. I don't know about you. I hope that you've gotten a lot out of it as well. Throughout this whole thing, we have seen so many characters throughout the Bible. Real people who lived, but we can study the way that they went wayward and hopefully avoid the mistakes that they made going forward. I think Aaron, for example, was the first one that we focused on from the book of Exodus. He was the de facto leader of the Israelites, and he allowed himself to be pushed around by them a little bit. They wanted an idol. He could have said no. He didn't. He allowed peer pressure to cause him to go wayward. And don't we do that sometimes too? So in our groups today, we're going to talk about ways that we maybe have allowed other people's voices and influences in our lives to be higher, to have more priority than what God thinks. We also talked about Samson, right? And how he allowed himself to be so distracted by the people around him and women around him that he didn't even notice God's presence had left him. He leaned back on the faith of his parents and what they had prayed over him, their faith, instead of his own faith. He allowed himself to be distracted. And do we allow ourselves to be distracted in any area of our life? We also talked about Judas in this series, and Judas allowed himself to take offense at Jesus, of all people, right? Somebody he had aligned himself under. He was supposed to be teachable in that moment, learn from what Jesus was doing. Instead, he got offended by it. He was greedy. He totally missed the point of what Jesus was trying to do. And do we ever let offense get us so far off track, so far wayward, that we are no longer able to be teachable by God in our lives? We also talked about Jonah. Jonah wanted a God of judgment, right? Not a God of mercy. For himself, he wanted a God of mercy, but for everybody else, he wanted a God of judgment. And we do this too. We get judgy. We judge the people around us. We want God to rain down fire from heaven, but for us, we want mercy. Mercy, please, for me, God. Judgment for the rest of the world. And so have you done that in your life? Have you allowed judgment to take over instead of God's opinion of the situation? And finally, this week, we talked about Demas. And this is where we're going to focus a little bit more strongly than the others this week, because Demas had a love for the world instead of a love for God. Paul clearly says that Demas was his disciple at one point. He was a partner in ministry. He was helping him spread the gospel, the good news about Jesus. And then one day he decided, I like the world. I like the stuff of this world better than I like ministry to God. And off he goes to Thessalonica. 1 John 2:16 was something that we focused on this weekend. And it says, for the world only offers a craving for physical pleasure, a craving for everything we see, and pride in our achievements and possessions. It comes down to those base three evil tendencies that we have that cause the rest of the sin in our lives: pride, lust, and greed. Are we allowing any of those things to overtake us, to control us to the point where we no longer care what God thinks about our lives? The Bible also says to guard your heart above all else. So how do you go about guarding your heart in everyday life? Are there ways that you do this that maybe the rest of the group can learn from? So let's talk about that tonight. I hope you have a great discussion. We'll see you guys next week.